Station Gamma 7 hung in the void like a metallic barnacle clinging to the edge of respectability, orbiting a gas giant that nobody had bothered naming because, frankly, who cares about another swirling ball of hydrogen when you've cataloged 17,000 of them? The station itself served as a refueling depot and maintenance hub for, according to YouTube analytics, 98% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. Ships traversing the outer commercial routes, which was a fancy way of saying it was a cosmic truck stop where the coffee was terrible and the bathrooms were questionable at best. The maintenance crew numbered 47 beings from a dozen different species, each one absolutely convinced their particular evolutionary path had granted them superior problem-solving capabilities. The Vexori, with their 6 manipulator appendages and compound eyes, considered themselves the galaxy's premier engineers. The Thornback delegation moved with deliberate precision, their crystalline logic processors calculating efficiency ratios that would make a quantum computer weep with inadequacy. Then there were the Carvathi, bear-like creatures standing 8 feet tall with fur that shifted colors based on mood, who handled heavy lifting and structural work with the kind of brute competence that made them invaluable, if occasionally terrifying. And then there was the human, one singular human, assigned to the station 3 cycles ago through what most of the crew assumed was either a bureaucratic error or perhaps an elaborate practical joke orchestrated by whatever deity governed personnel assignments. Humans had joined the greater galactic community only 2 generations prior, and the consensus among established spacefaring civilizations remained decidedly mixed. Sure, they'd figured out faster-than-light travel eventually, and yes, they'd managed not to immediately blow themselves up with it, which already put them ahead of the Corinth. But their methods, their approaches, their entire philosophical framework regarding how things should work clashed with thousands of years of established protocol. The human in question stood approximately 6 feet tall, possessed the standard bipedal configuration, and had a tendency to hum something called classic rock while working, which nobody else found nearly as entertaining as the human seemed to believe. The crew had taken to simply referring to their colleague as the human, not out of disrespect necessarily, but because pronouncing the actual name required vocal cord arrangements that half the species present simply didn't possess. On this particular rotation, Station Gamma 7 faced what the Vexori maintenance chief called a Category 4 malfunction, which was technical speak for "we're completely screwed unless someone fixes this immediately." The primary reactor cooling system had developed a cascade failure, which meant that within approximately 6 hours, the entire station would either shut down completely or, in a less desirable scenario, achieve an exciting new understanding of thermodynamics through practical demonstration. The maintenance bay buzzed with activity, if you could call standing around gesturing frantically at holographic displays activity. The Vexori chief's antennae vibrated with agitation as multiple screens flickered data that all essentially said the same thing. "This is bad. This is very bad. Why aren't you fixing this yet?" "The coupling manifold has fractured," announced a Thornback technician, their voice carrying the flat affect of someone delivering a weather report about the apocalypse. "Standard repair protocol requires 17 hours of systematic component replacement. We have 6 hours, the chief responded, which everyone already knew but apparently needed reiterating. "The backup parts requisition won't arrive for another 22 hours, added a Vexori engineer, manipulator appendages dancing across a control panel. "The supply freighter is delayed." Of course it was delayed. Supply freighters existed in a quantum state of perpetual delay, arriving either too late or occasionally, through some miracle of physics, before they'd actually departed, which just created paperwork nobody wanted to deal with. The human had been standing quietly near the back of the gathered crowd, arms crossed, watching the reactor diagnostics with the kind of expression that suggested wheels were turning behind those oddly mobile eyes. "I could take a look at it," the human offered, not for the first time. The maintenance bay fell silent in that particular way that groups fall silent when someone has said something so absurd that it takes a moment for everyone's brains to process whether they've actually heard it correctly. "You," the Vexori chief said slowly, antennae tilting forward, "wish to attempt repairs on a quantum thermal regulator Mark 7. "I've worked on similar systems," the human replied with a shrug, which was a peculiar gesture involving the raising and lowering of shoulders that somehow conveyed both acknowledgement and dismissal simultaneously. "Similar systems," repeated a Thornback, their crystalline faceplates reflecting the amber warning lights. "Humans have been spacefaring for barely 70 rotations. The Mark 7 has been industry standard for 3,000. "Right, but cooling systems are cooling systems," the human said, moving toward the reactor access corridor. "Liquid coolant circulates, transfers heat, radiates it away. The principles don't really change just because you make it fancier." The crew exchanged glances, or the equivalent thereof, for species that didn't actually possess glances. The Vexori chief's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement, or possibly alarm. "The human believes that 3 millennia of refined engineering can be reduced to liquid goes around. Heat comes out. I mean, fundamentally, yes," the human replied, already pulling up schematics on a portable display. "You can dress it up with quantum coupling and thermal resonance fields. All you want, but at the end of the cycle, it's still just plumbing." Calling a quantum thermal regulator. Mark 7 just plumbing was roughly equivalent to calling a symphony orchestra just noise, or referring to the great pillars of Vex as just some rocks. Several crew members made sounds that their respective species reserved for moments of profound disagreement. "This should be entertaining," muttered one of the Carvathi, the massive bear-like creature's fur shifting to an amused orange. "I'm taking wagers on how long before the human admits defeat." 20 minutes, offered a Vexori. 10, countered a Thornback. The human, either oblivious to or deliberately ignoring the betting pool forming around their imminent failure, had already gathered a toolkit and was heading toward the reactor access shaft. "I'll need someone to monitor the readings from inside," the human called back. "You want to go inside the reactor housing while it's still active?" The chief's voice carried several octaves of disbelief. "Well, I can't exactly fix it from out here, can I?" The logic was simultaneously flawless and completely insane, which pretty much summarized the human approach to most situations. The chief's antennae drooped in resignation. "Fine, but when you trigger a containment breach, don't expect us to scrape what's left of you off the walls." "Noted," the human said cheerfully, disappearing into the access corridor. The rest of the crew settled in to watch the inevitable disaster unfold. They gathered around monitoring stations, pulling up feeds from the internal cameras, because if this was going to be a catastrophic failure, they might as well have a good view of it. Some species had a word for finding entertainment in others' misfortune. Humans called it schadenfreude, which was fitting considering they'd probably invented the concept. Inside the reactor housing, the human's figure appeared on the monitors, illuminated by the pulsing blue glow of the quantum cores. The temperature in there hovered around 140 degrees, which would have been instantly lethal for most species. Humans, absurdly, could tolerate it for short periods, though sweat was already visible on the human's face, which was apparently their body's way of saying this is fine, everything is fine, we're definitely not dying right now. "The fracture is in the tertiary coupling." The human's voice crackled over the communication system. "I can see it from here. That component requires a clean room environment for replacement," the chief responded, "and specialized equipment we don't currently have." "Yeah, about that," the human said, and through the camera feed, the crew watched as the human pulled out what appeared to be a roll of metallic tape. "I'm thinking we might be able to patch it." The collective gasp from the maintenance crew could probably have been heard in the next solar system. "You cannot patch a quantum coupling manifold with tape," the Thornback technician stated, as if explaining basic physics to a particularly dense asteroid. "It's not regular tape," the human replied, already applying the material around the fractured component. "It's high-temperature industrial bonding wrap, rated for extreme conditions." "It's still tape." "Fancy tape," the human corrected. The Vexori chief pressed manipulator appendages against their face, which was their species equivalent of a profound face palm. This was it. This was how Station Gamma 7 would end. Not with a bang, but with a human and a roll of tape. But the human kept working, hands moving with careful precision despite the oppressive heat, despite the mockery echoing through the communication system, despite the absolute certainty radiating from every other crew member that this approach would fail spectacularly. The human wrapped the coupling, reinforced the connection points, and then, inexplicably, pulled out what appeared to be a small hammer. "Now what are you doing?" the chief asked, voice strained. "Percussive maintenance," the human replied, tapping the housing with controlled strikes. "Percussive maintenance. Sometimes you've got to knock things back into place." The crew watched in horrified fascination as the human essentially hit a piece of equipment worth more than some planetary budgets with a hammer. It was like watching someone try to tune a quantum orchestra by throwing rocks at it. The temperature readings fluctuated, the pressure gauges danced, and somewhere in the station's central computer, alarm protocols were having an existential crisis about whether this qualified as a repair attempt or active sabotage. And then, impossibly, the readings began to stabilize. The fracture seal was holding, the coolant flow resumed. The cascade failure stopped cascading and started just being a regular, manageable failure. The human emerged from the reactor housing 30 minutes later, drenched in sweat, carrying a toolkit and wearing an expression that somehow managed to convey both exhaustion and vindication. "Should hold until the replacement parts arrive," the human announced to the silent maintenance bay. Nobody said anything for a long moment. The Vexori who'd wagered 20 minutes looked particularly dismayed. Finally, the chief's antennae twitched. "You fixed a quantum thermal regulator Mark 7 with tape and a hammer. And some percussive maintenance," the human added helpfully. "This violates approximately 47 different safety protocols." "But it works." And that, unfortunately, was the problem with humans. Their solutions shouldn't work. They violated every principle of proper engineering, ignored established procedures, and treated technology that had taken millennia to develop like it was something you could fix with whatever happened to be lying around. But somehow, frustratingly, impossibly, they got results. The chief's mandibles clicked in resignation. File a report and never speak of the tape to anyone. The human grinned, which was another one of those peculiar expressions that showed far too many teeth to be anything but vaguely threatening, and headed toward the shower facilities, leaving behind a crew that was equal parts relieved, confused, and slightly annoyed that their betting pool had been so thoroughly disrupted. In the shadows near the auxiliary corridor, 3 small figures had been watching the entire proceeding with wide eyes and increasing fascination. The Karvathi cubs, offspring of the heavy-lifting crew members, weren't technically supposed to be in the maintenance areas, but cubs were curious creatures, and the sight of someone actually doing something rather than just standing around talking about doing something had captured their complete attention. They watched the human disappear down the corridor, then looked at each other with the kind of expression that suggested an idea was forming, which was generally when adults started getting nervous. The temporary fix held for exactly 4 hours before the reactor decided it had other opinions about being repaired with what the Thornback delegation kept calling primitive adhesive methodology. The alarm systems, which had briefly enjoyed a moment of silence, erupted back into their usual symphony of impending doom. This time, however, the problem manifested in a different section entirely. The secondary heat exchanger had developed what the diagnostic systems politely termed a critical structural compromise, which was engineering speak for its cracked and leaking coolant everywhere. The human volunteered again, naturally, because apparently one brush with potential incineration wasn't sufficient for the day. "Absolutely not," the Vexori chief declared. All 6 manipulator appendages crossed in a gesture of absolute refusal. "The secondary exchanger requires precision recalibration. This is not something you can fix by hitting it." "I wasn't planning on hitting this one," the human replied, already reviewing the damage reports. Your track record suggests otherwise. The human ignored this assessment and headed toward the maintenance lockers, emerging with an armload of equipment that made several crew members wince. Welding torch, sealant compound, what appeared to be wire salvaged from a communications panel, and inexplicably, a container of something the human claimed was epoxy but looked suspiciously like paste you'd use for children's art projects. This should be documented, one Vexori engineer muttered to another. For the investigation afterward. After what? After whatever catastrophe the human is about to cause. The human set up a workspace directly beneath the damaged exchanger, laying out tools with the kind of casual confidence that made experienced engineers deeply uncomfortable. Proper protocol dictated a full system shutdown, depressurization, sterile environment preparation, and approximately 9 hours of careful disassembly. The human's approach apparently involved climbing up there right now and seeing what happened. The structural integrity is compromised, a Thornback observed, pointing at readings that showed stress fractures spreading through the exchanger housing. Attempting repairs while the system remains pressurized could result in explosive decompression. Could, the human agreed, already ascending the maintenance ladder. But probably won't. Probably won't was not typically considered an acceptable risk assessment in engineering circles, yet here they were, watching the human scramble up toward a piece of equipment that was essentially a pressurized bomb having a very bad day. The crew gathered around the monitoring stations again, because apparently they hadn't learned their lesson about doubting the human's survival instincts. Though this time, the atmosphere carried less certainty about the human's inevitable failure, and more a disturbing suspicion that somehow, against all reasonable expectations, this might actually work again. Taking bets, announced the same Karvathi from earlier, first shifting to an entrepreneurial green. 20 credits says the human lasts 5 minutes before retreating. 30 says the human succeeds, but we all pretend it didn't happen, countered another crew member. Up in the exchanger housing, the human had already identified the primary crack and was doing something with the welding torch that made the chief's antennae stand straight up in alarm. The human wasn't following any standard welding pattern, instead moving in short, controlled bursts that somehow avoided the dozen sensitive components surrounding the damaged area. That's not proper technique, a Vexori engineer complained. And yet, another responded, watching the readouts stabilize incrementally. It appears to be working, which was becoming an increasingly irritating pattern where the human was concerned. The human had been working on the exchanger for 20 minutes when the first cub appeared. Small for a Karvathi, standing perhaps 4 feet tall with fur that cycled through curious shades of purple and blue. The youngster approached the workspace with the kind of careful boldness that characterized children universally testing boundaries. "You're not supposed to be here," the human said without looking down, apparently possessing some sixth sense about being watched by small creatures. The cub tilted its head, studying the human's welding work with intense focus. "Why do you use fire on the metal?" "To make it stick back together," the human explained, pausing to wipe sweat from their forehead. "Heat melts it slightly, lets it fuse. The Vexori use molecular bonders. Don't have a molecular bonder, do have a welding torch." This logic appeared to resonate with the cub, who moved closer, watching as the human applied sealant compound around the newly welded section. 2 more cubs materialized from wherever young Karvathi hid when they were supposed to be elsewhere, their fur displaying matching shades of fascinated orange. The maintenance crew, still monitoring from their stations, noticed the new arrivals with varying degrees of alarm. "Someone should remove those cubs," the chief suggested, though nobody moved to actually do it, partly because Karvathi cubs were notoriously difficult to relocate when curious, and partly because everyone was too invested in watching this increasingly bizarre situation unfold. "Can I help?" the first cub asked, reaching toward the toolbox. The human glanced down, then shrugged in that peculiar human gesture. "Sure, hand me that smaller wrench, the one that looks like an L." The cub's fur brightened with pride, carefully selecting the requested tool and passing it up. The other 2 cubs immediately pressed forward, not wanting to be excluded from whatever was happening. "What about us?" one demanded. "Hold this," the human said, passing down a section of wire. "Keep it untangled." And just like that, the human had acquired a miniature maintenance crew. The adult crew members watched in stunned silence as the cubs began actively participating in the repair work. The human would call out needs, simple tasks, really. Holding things, fetching tools, maintaining tension on components, and the cubs would scramble to comply with an enthusiasm that made their usual handlers question why they couldn't get that kind of cooperation during actual training sessions. "This is highly irregular," the Thornback technician observed. "The cubs are learning improper procedures," a Vexori added. "The cubs are learning," corrected one of the adult Karvathi, watching their offspring work with something approaching wonder in their expression. When did we last see them this engaged with maintenance tasks? It was a fair question. Karvathi cubs typically showed minimal interest in technical work, preferring physical activities and social play. Yet here they were, completely absorbed in helping the human jerry-rig a heat exchanger with whatever materials happened to be available. "Why do you not wait for proper parts?" one cub asked, holding a support strut steady while the human reinforced a connection. "Because waiting means the station shuts down," the human replied, testing the seal integrity. "Sometimes you have to work with what you've got. But the others say this way is wrong." "It's not wrong if it works. It's just different." The cub considered this, fur shifting through thoughtful yellows and greens. "Different, but working is better than correct, but waiting." "Now you're getting it," the human said with a grin. Up at the monitoring stations, the chief's antennae drooped in resignation as the readouts showed the exchanger stabilizing again. Not only was the human succeeding with another improvised repair, but now the cubs were learning these absolutely incorrect, yet frustratingly effective methods. "We're going to have a generation of Karvathi engineers who think tape and hammers are legitimate tools," someone muttered. "Tape and hammers are legitimate tools," the human's voice crackled over the still open communication channel. "You just have to know when to use them." The cubs chittered with amusement, their fur flashing bright, happy colors as they continued their work. Whatever disdain the adult crew felt about the human's methodology, the youngsters had no such reservations. To them, this was simply problem-solving, pure and uncomplicated by thousands of years of established protocol and procedural orthodoxy. And watching them work together, the human patiently explaining each step while the cubs eagerly assisted, it became increasingly difficult to argue with the results. 3 hours later, the replacement parts finally arrived, which meant they were technically unnecessary since the reactor was running at acceptable efficiency levels, thanks to the human's improvised repairs and the surprisingly competent assistance of 3 Karvathi cubs who were now walking around like they'd personally saved the station, which, to be fair, they sort of had. The maintenance chief stood before the reactor readouts, antennae twitching in patterns that suggested deep internal conflict. All indicators showed stable operations. Temperature nominal, pressure steady, flow rates within acceptable parameters. The entire system hummed along contentedly, held together by what officially would need to be described as unconventional repair methodology, and what unofficially was tape, wire, creative welding, and the enthusiastic participation of children. "This should not have worked," the chief stated, not for the first time that shift. "And yet," the human replied, wiping grease-stained hands on an equally grease-stained cloth. The cubs stood nearby, their fur displaying proud golden hues, occasionally showing off the tools they'd used to their parents, who looked torn between pride and horror. One cub was explaining in enthusiastic detail how you could use percussive maintenance on stuck components, complete with demonstration strikes against the air that made several adults flinch. "You've taught them to hit things," one Karvathi parent said, though their tone carried less accusation than resigned acceptance. "I taught them to problem solve," the human corrected. "The hitting is just one technique among many, a technique not found in any standard maintenance manual. Your manuals assume you always have the right parts and unlimited time," the human pointed out. "Reality doesn't usually cooperate with that assumption." The thornback technician approached, crystalline faceplates reflecting the now calm reactor lights. I have reviewed the repair documentation. Your methods, while effective, cannot be replicated by standard maintenance protocols. That's because standard maintenance protocols assume everyone thinks the same way, the human said. Sometimes you need different approaches. Different, the technician repeated, the word carrying weight. The Cubs learned more about practical engineering in 3 hours with you than in months of formal instruction. This observation hung in the air while the chief's antennae performed what could only be described as an elaborate gesture of surrender. The human hadn't just fixed the reactor against all reasonable expectations. The human had accidentally created a teaching moment that undermined thousands of years of established training methodology by demonstrating that sometimes enthusiasm and creative thinking mattered more than following procedures that assumed you always had optimal conditions. The next supply run will bring proper replacement components, the chief finally announced. We will install them according to regulations. Sure, the human agreed amiably. But until then, the station's running fine. Fine was perhaps generous, but it was certainly running, which was more than could be said for several hours ago when the crew had been standing around calculating doom timelines and placing bets on human failure rates. The Cubs had already moved on to pestering the human about what else needed fixing. Their earlier hesitation completely evaporated. They'd discovered that maintenance work wasn't boring procedural drudgery when approached with the human's philosophy of figure it out as you go and use whatever works. As the shift ended and the crew dispersed to their various rest cycles, the Karvathi, who'd organized the original betting pool, approached the human with a data pad. You cost me 20 credits. Should have bet on me succeeding, the human replied with that toothy grin. Nobody with functional reasoning would have bet on tape and hammers saving a station. And yet here we are, station saved, reactor running, Cubs educated. The human stretched, joints popping in that disturbing way human skeletal systems occasionally did. Maybe next time you'll have more faith in improvisation. There will not be a next time, the Karvathi insisted. We will have proper parts and proper procedures. Sure, the human said again, in that tone that suggested complete disbelief in the statement. And watching the human walk away, followed by 3 Cubs chattering excitedly about percussive maintenance and creative problem-solving, the Karvathi had the uncomfortable suspicion that the human was absolutely right. There would be a next time. There was always a next time. The only difference now was that the station had backup maintenance crew who thought hitting things with hammers was a legitimate engineering solution, which was either the best thing that had ever happened to Station Gamma 7 or a disaster waiting to unfold. Probably both, the Karvathi decided, which was starting to feel like the defining characteristic of having humans around.